Hello and welcome to the IIP podcast Peace Matters, a podcast which deals with international relations and geopolitics. Today is our 16th episode and we are going to discuss Russia's war against Ukraine. Where are we now? Today's experts are Gerhard Mangott. He is professor of political science of Innsbruck University and an expert on post-Soviet space region. And Richard Grieveson, he is the deputy director of the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. I hope you find this episode interesting. Please like and subscribe. Thank you very much for joining me today in our newest episode on the podcast Peace Matters. Today we are talking about 2 years of war against Ukraine. Where are we now? It has been very difficult years. It doesn't really seem that the end of the war is upcoming, which is very unfortunate. And I'm very happy that I have two wonderful guests who are experts on Russia, Ukraine, Eastern Europe, and especially also on the economic situation. So I think we're going to have an interesting discussion. I would already like to start with you, Gerhard, on the war against Ukraine, 2 years. What do you say, where are we now? And maybe very briefly, when I was researching questions, just put it on Google, I actually came up that many people literally asked a question which seems to be very basic, because the question is, why did this war actually happen? What would be your take on this one?
Well, I think that the Russian leadership had an interest in keeping Ukraine in its orbit, wanted to control Ukrainian, particularly foreign policy. And this idea was actually almost collapsing in 2014 when we had a sort of coup d'etat, we have to say it this way, because the change in power in 2014, in February 2014, in Ukraine was unconstitutional, but still legitimate. And when Russia realized that Ukraine definitely was lost, or almost was lost to the West, the Russians started the first episode of the war with the occupation and annexation of Crimea and the support for separatist movements in the east of Ukraine. And after those years, a sort of a peace process was prepared, negotiated and signed between Russia, Ukraine, Germany and France, the so-called Minsk Agreement, which actually would have led to a comprehensive and sustained ceasefire and political reforms. But this process collapsed in 2021, 2022, and Russia realized that now definitely they would lose control over Ukraine, and then the decision was taken in order to stop this process of increasing rapprochement of Ukraine with the West. We need to start a war.
You said that the war was partly also started because the Ukraine oriented itself mostly then more towards the West. And I would already like to come to you, Richard. When it comes to the West, this war has huge impact also on the so-called Western countries, especially also Europe and the European Union. And immediately, when the war broke out in this very large scale in 2022, the large-scale war on the whole of the country, the Western world united very quickly. So we imposed many, many sanctions, and we put a lot of hopes into these sanctions. However, we see that we didn't manage actually to bring Russia to stop the war in this. So what would you say? Did we just put too much emphasis on the sanctions, or what would be your take on how we approach this whole sanction regime?
I mean, the short answer is yes. We put too much hope on the sanctions, clearly. I mean, I remember, if we go back 2 years, there were credible economic institutes predicting that the Russian economy would contract by 15% in the first year of the war. Nothing like that has happened, and that's clearly a big overestimation, partly because we overestimated how much of an impact the sanctions would have. I think looking back, we shouldn't be that surprised. There were clearly big things which were clear at the time that we have to be honest about now. One is that there have been carve-outs from the sanctions. This is not a kind of complete isolation of Russia from the global economy, especially in energy. There have been major carve-outs. Secondly, Russia has important alliances. It is a big country. On its own terms, it has a very close relationship with China in particular. And a lot of what has been lost in terms of inputs from the West of sanctioned goods, it is able to get via other sources. We hear a lot about Central Asian countries, about Armenia, but I think two countries are really important. Turkey is important, but China especially. And given the relationship Russia has with China, we shouldn't be that surprised also in that sense about how they've been able to get around the sanctions. And the third thing, the final thing, is I think they were prepared for this. The Russian the leadership took a decision, I think at least 10 years ago, maybe longer than that they wanted to limit their geo-economic vulnerabilities. They wanted to keep public debt low, external debt low, limit their exposure especially to the US dollar. They did that pretty successfully. It came at the expense of economic development in Russia over the last 10 years. And they obviously didn't do everything. A lot of their foreign reserves have been famously frozen. But in general, this is a difficult country to sanction, actually. Certainly if you compare it to somewhere like Turkey or other countries which have much bigger external vulnerabilities, Russia simply doesn't have those. So I think we did, for a number of reasons, invest too much hope in the sanctions.
Very interesting. I would also like to hear your opinion, obviously, then also on the sanctions and how they impact the war, maybe in the long term. But I would like to go back to this very important question about how the war could finally end. We know at this point, nobody actually seems to have a huge hope that the war will end soon. But what would be your take? Like, what could be scenarios where we can imagine that the war will, at one point, come to an end? And maybe also, who could be influencing Russia? Is it going to be the United States? Is it going to be maybe China? What would be your take on that question?
Well, at the moment, at least, both warring parties still believe that they can win the war on the battlefield. No one is interested in negotiations. Ukraine now is on the defensive. It has a new strategy, meaning active defense. That means that there will be no offensive by the Ukrainian armed forces this year, but they will try to build defensive lines in order to keep the Russians away from the front line. If this is going to succeed, very much depends on whether the Western countries continue with their military and financial support. Well, if there are no negotiations possible at the moment, we can think about three scenarios according to which the war can end. The first scenario is that a third party intervenes in the war and forces the two warring parties to negotiate at least about an armistice. This is very unlikely. The second scenario is that one of the warring parties actually wins the war and then dictates a peace agreement. Also very unlikely. And the third scenario is, I think, the most realistic one, although also not imminent. The third scenario would be that at some point both warring parties are totally exhausted and no longer believe in a successful outcome of the war on the battlefield, and that brings them to the table, to the negotiation table, and they try to find an agreement, at least on an armistice. I don't believe that in the forthcoming years, in the next 5, 6, 7 years, there will be a chance for a peace agreement between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. But from all those three scenarios, we are still very much away. But the third one, I think, is the most realistic one. And some in Western countries already think that the best way to keep the war from escalating is to freeze it at the current front line, which has pros and cons, is very contested as a political proposal. But I could think that finally the war will come down with a freezing of hostilities and the signing of an armistice agreement.
But you would say we are still quite far away from this kind of scenario?
Absolutely,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. When it comes maybe again to the economic side, I mean, you already mentioned that Russia seemed to have been already prepared of this kind of sanctions regime, which then the West imposed on them. But you also argue, as far as I know, that Russia also turned its whole economy in kind of a war economy. Can you maybe explain to us non-economic people what that actually means? And maybe if you see also that this war has like also huge impact when it comes to the Western world on an economic side. I mean, the inflation and all those issues, the gas prices which have been rising so much. Do you think that the West maybe should also prepare a little bit for war economy? What would be your take on that one?
Yeah, I think Russia shows a lot of signs of a war economy. Nothing really comparable to what we saw during the Second World War, for example. But we have seen a major reorientation of resources towards defense and therefore away from other things. These big fiscal buffers that they built up in the pre-war years have started to be drawn down in order to support the military and everything associated with that. We see labor shortages, they're running out of people, which is another classic sign of a war economy. And by Russian standards, pretty high inflation. I mean, not dramatically, but in a country which has had a pretty good record of managing inflation, they do have a bit of a problem with inflation at the moment. So they're running up against these capacity constraints. Now, I think at this level, they can continue to finance a war of this intensity for a very long time, I would say. Any issues from a Russian perspective there are certainly not imminent. There are a couple of problems that they have with it, though. One, in the short term, is this issue of capacity constraints, that every time the economy starts to grow, and it is growing, and it has been much more robust and resilient than I think anybody expected at the start. But once the economy starts to grow and hits these capacity constraints, either of materials that they cannot source anymore, or they cannot source in the volume they had before, or of people, which is the real issue, I think, at the moment, inflation starts to rise, the central bank has to raise interest rates, and the economy slows again. So the economy cannot grow very much under these conditions, but it is growing. The longer term problem that they have is that they are reallocating so many resources towards the military and the defense industry away from other areas, and that will have long-term economic development implications, which are negative for Russia. That was partly the case anyway, for the reasons I already said. You know, they had already pursued a very sort of restrictive, conservative economic policy in order to build these defenses and keep their geopolitical room for maneuver open. So that's been the case for at least 10 years. But now even more so, they are doing things which will restrict the long-term economic development potential of the economy. So the economy has, in relative terms, it's going backwards and has been for quite a while versus the rest of Central and Eastern Europe, I would say. On the Western side, I mean, we hear this talk about the war economy. The Commission was recently talking about a war economy. I think it's very, very different from the Western side. I mean, even if we really go in that direction, let's say the US fully pulls out and Europe takes a decision, we want to, in a military sense, replace the US in the role that it has had. The EU economy is many times bigger than the Russian economy. It would not take the same kind of reorientation of resources that the Russians have had to do. I'm not sure if we'll do that anyway, but even if we did, it wouldn't be a true war economy in the sense of the Russian economy.
Thank you so much. Maybe you can also reflect a little bit on how actually Russia also managed then to reallocate its resources then more towards the eastern side, and that mainly also to China. I mean, how would you assess the relationship, the economic relationship between China and Russia today?
For Russia, this relationship is now of absolutely central importance. I think also on the political military side, but in economic terms, I think it cannot be overstated. A lot of what we have heard about, as I mentioned already, that Russia gets more from Armenia or gets more from Kyrgyzstan, it's simply not significant in volume terms. Turkey is a bit of a player, but basically it's all about China, and the whole situation for Russia would look very, very different if it wasn't for China. Russia has managed to get access to a very large majority of sanctioned goods, either the equivalent or a less good but still usable version of what they were getting before, and most of that comes via China. I mean, China is absolutely central. I think from the Chinese perspective, they don't want to see Russia defeated, clearly. I'm sure they're not delighted about this war, but they don't want Russia defeated and humiliated, and they've proven that they're willing to send a lot of support. But I think even on the Chinese side now, there are some constraints on this and the extent to which they can support Russia. We're seeing much more now of secondary sanctions from the US, meaning that, yes, the trade between China and Russia is often now in yuan, not a problem in the sense of sanctions. But the entities in China doing this trade still need to trade with other people as well. And that still, most of the time, means dollars if it's foreign trade. And that's where the US secondary sanctions come in. So we do see, even in the case of China, the power of the US, and especially the power of the dollar, and the weaponization of the dollar is still very significant.
Gerhard, he already mentioned China, but Putin said something very specific a couple of months ago. He actually said, we are in a never-ending war with the West. How do you assess the situation? Because we try not to escalate, we try not to put boots on the ground, even though the discussion has been reshaped literally a little bit recently, especially when Macron made his statement about this so-called strategic ambiguity. Maybe we shouldn't tell them we are never going to put boots on the ground. How do you assess the situation? What does it mean for the West if Putin actually says, I am in a never-ending war with the West?
Well, this war with the West has started already many, many years ago. Putin has been clearly disappointed about how he and the country were treated by Western powers. At the beginning of Putin's reign in 2000, there was a clear readiness on the Russian side to cooperate with the West, not because Russia was so much, or Putin was so much convinced by democracy or the rule of law or good governance, but he realized at the time that Russia would never become a great power again without cooperating with Western economies. But then he felt betrayed, particularly by the unilateralist policies of the Bush administration, and that's when his negative attitude towards the West intensified and is now clearly a very important feature of his personality. Well, the West is delivering weapons to Ukraine, which, according to international law, doesn't make Western countries parties of the war. They only assist Ukraine in its effort to defend itself according to Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. However, from a political science point of view, we can clearly say we are in something like a war between the West and Russia for all the efforts the West has put in place to isolate Russia, to weaken Russia, to support the Ukrainian military, even having boots on the ground from the United States, the United Kingdom, and France in Ukraine. So from a political science point of view, I would say we are close to sort of a war, but not in the sense of international law. That's really true. If the West will ever send ground forces to Ukraine is still an open question. You have already mentioned Macron's announcement that he doesn't rule out, or he doesn't want to rule out, that at some point Western forces will be sent to Ukraine. As you said, he wanted to create what is called strategic ambiguity. His supporters say he wanted to signal to Russia, you cannot be sure what our red lines are, which lines we are ready to cross. However, this effort in creating such a strategic ambiguity failed already the next day, when almost all governments in Europe said, no, we will not send soldiers to Ukraine. So it had the opposite effect. The Russian government now knows that most of the European countries are really and will remain reluctant to send their soldiers to Ukraine.
Why do you think this is the case? I mean, is it because Russia is a nuclear power? I think we tend to forget about this big danger also that this war can escalate ultimately, in the worst case scenario, into a nuclear disaster. Do you think that this is part of the reason that Russia can actually do what they are doing in Ukraine because they are a nuclear power?
Yes, I think that's certainly a very important point. You know, when Western powers like France say they will eventually send soldiers to Ukraine, then the question is, what will be the purpose of these soldiers? Will they be a fighting force alongside the Ukrainian army? And what military goals should be achieved with Western support? The Ukrainian government says we want to restore the territorial integrity of 1991 and kick out the Russian forces from all the territory of Ukraine, including Crimea and Sevastopol. If that is the war objective of the Ukrainian government, and this war objective is supported by some Western powers with their soldiers on the ground, then there's a clear danger of an escalation of the conflict, which could be either horizontal, meaning that further countries will be will be into this war, or it could be, more importantly, a vertical escalation, namely that Russia will use tactical nuclear weapons to defend against an offensive Ukrainian army with Western support. Why? Because I do think that if there will be a threat to Russia's control over Crimea, then the leadership in Russia will be ready to think about the use of tactical nuclear weapons, but only in such a military scenario, when Crimea is about to get lost. But this is a scenario we cannot see at the moment. Maybe it will never happen. But if Western forces are in Ukraine, and the objective of the forces, as Macron said, is to prevent Russia from winning the war, then we are on the path to a possible escalation, which could be, at the end of the day, also nuclear.
Yeah, so we should at least take it seriously. So the danger is still out there, which isn't really a very good outlook. But if we go back then to what is happening now in Ukraine, it's already the third year of war, which means we are witnessing a destruction of infrastructure, traumatized people, many dead people, soldiers, civilians, but also millions of refugees, partly within Ukraine, but many of them also went to the European Union. What does this mean also a little bit in a longer term for Ukraine, if you assume that many of those refugees might not actually go back? So what does this mean for the economic state of Ukraine as it is right now? I mean, how do you assess the situation?
I mean, clearly the economic situation in Ukraine is still very difficult. The economy contracted by about a third, almost a third in the first year of the war. Also in the end, better than expected. I mean, both Russia and Ukraine did better than expected, but clearly the impact on Ukraine has been much more severe. The economy is recovering. There's been some pretty impressive adaptation in parts of the economy, a lot of relocation of production and that kind of thing. But under these conditions, the situation is and will remain very difficult. I think the demographic question is probably the most difficult of all. A lot of people are talking about reconstruction. We're also working on it, although given the situation on the ground, it really feels very early still, I think, to be talking about reconstruction. But when we get to that point and what the economic future of Ukraine is, the loss of people at that point will become a very severe constraint on how the economy can be rebuilt. I think we know from history, after a conflict ends, when economies are rebuilt, infrastructure can be rebuilt. It's expensive, but it can be done. Getting people to come back is much more difficult. And the longer that the war goes on, especially the women and children who are here in Western Europe and in places like Poland, they're more and more integrated. The children at school, they learn the languages. Getting them to come back will be much more difficult. So I think on the one hand, it's too early to talk about this anyway. We're still deep in the war. The economic situation is really difficult, and it's really about survival and adaptation under wartime conditions. And as Professor Mangott has outlined, that might be the reality unfortunately, for quite a number of years yet for Ukraine. But I think when we get to the reconstruction phase, the issue of labor and getting people to come back may be the most difficult challenge of all.
And if we can talk a little bit about reconstruction, because it is a very important topic, even though we are still far away, because Ukraine is still actually being attacked and distracted. But who could actually support Ukraine then in reconstructing? We also know, which is something which wasn't on the agenda before the large-scale war against Ukraine, which is European Union membership. How do you assess the situation there? How could Ukraine profit from this process? We know it's a very long process, so Ukraine is still very far away to become actually a European Union member. But is it supporting them? So is the European Union going to be there if Ukraine needs reconstruction?
Yes, I mean, the EU will be the key player in this. The US may well be currently still the most important military supporter of Ukraine, but already economically the EU is the key player, and it will be even more so in the future. I mean, it feels strange to talk about positives, but that is the potential positive that comes out of all of this for Ukraine. There is a way now, a route towards EU membership, which simply wasn't there before. I think despite the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, I mean, there were important economic integration initiatives before, but it's completely different now. There's an opening for EU enlargement which didn't exist before. That is potentially transformative for the Ukrainian economy if they can follow that route. I mean, there are two basic scenarios on EU integration. There is the 2004-2007 joiners scenario, the Poland, Romania kind of scenario, where you get a lot of foreign direct investment, you get access to the EU budget, you do all the reforms, you upgrade your export capacity, the economy grows, you converge, and you catch up gradually with Western Europe. And it is economically transformative. It has been for those countries. The other scenario is the Western Balkans scenario, where the whole thing, especially over the last decade, is a bit of a pretense from both sides, where theoretically there is an enlargement process, but nobody really believes in it, and it doesn't really move forward very much. And there, the economic part is simply not transformative. It hasn't been transformative in the Western Balkans. You don't get the foreign investors, you don't get the reforms, you don't get the EU budget access and all of that. So for Ukraine, I think there are two very, very clear scenarios. I think it's theoretically possible for Ukraine to follow the Poland scenario. I mean, if you look at the fundamentals of Ukraine at the start, at the very start, as it is of its EU accession process, they're not extremely different to, say, Romania. I mean, this idea that Ukraine is somehow uniquely backwards, uniquely corrupt, uniquely in a difficult situation economically, there isn't a great deal of evidence for that, actually. I think the question will be more, what is the credibility of the enlargement process? I mean, one of the things we've seen in the Western Balkans is this bilateralization of it in individual countries in the EU, vetoing individual candidate countries. North Macedonia has been struggling with this for 2 decades now, basically, and doesn't seem any end in sight. And we can see with the agriculture, for example, very clearly how there would be member states within the EU who would be concerned about Ukraine's full membership. So that is one challenge. And the other part is the security part. I think all of this that's been so successful in places like Poland and Romania has relied on the security dimension as well. These countries have also joined NATO. There is ultimately the US security guarantee that stands behind all of that. I think if Ukraine can get those two things, a really credible EU enlargement process and a really credible security guarantee, and I think at this point it would have to be from the US, both things look honestly difficult to imagine from the point of view of today, but if those things happen, there is a potentially transformative economic future for Ukraine. But I think we are, unfortunately for Ukraine, quite far from that at the moment.
Yes, because I think it's not just a question if Ukraine will be at one day ready for accession to the European Union. The question also is, and this is the more difficult question, will the European Union be able to absorb new members or a big member such as Ukraine? In order to do that, we need to revise the EU treaty because if Ukraine is in and the Western Balkan countries will be in, the membership of the European Union will stand at 36, and you cannot actually handle such a huge number of members with the current EU treaty, particularly its stipulations on how decisions are taken. So in order to make the European Union ready to absorb new members, you need to change the treaty, but that is something that no European government wants to do, because once you open that Pandora box of changing the treaty, you never know in which direction it will develop, and if a new revised EU treaty will be accepted by all member states, by all current member states in the European Union. And for NATO, I think that we have seen what happened at the NATO summit in Vilnius last July. Once again, there is no unanimity within the alliance on accepting Ukraine as a member. There are a lot of governments who don't want to have Ukraine inside the alliance. Of course, everyone agrees Ukraine cannot join NATO while the war is still waging. But even after the war will be over, I'm not sure whether there will be a membership perspective for Ukraine. What is currently done is not to provide Ukraine with a security guarantee based on Article 5 of the NATO founding treaty, but what is currently negotiated is security agreements between various great powers or middle powers with Ukraine, but they do not contain a security guarantee, but just a security assurance that Western powers will continue to support Ukraine militarily and financially in its clash with the Russian Federation. So I'm really very doubtful if we will see Ukraine in NATO in the foreseeable future.
But Ukraine also put it in its constitution that they're going to be NATO members, that they're going to be European Union members. Do you think this is something, was it a mistake, or do you think it's just like the orientation they want to show we are part of the Western world and we will keep on striving for it, even though it doesn't really seem to be, let's say, very close, that neither NATO accession, and you also mentioned the problematics with the European Union enlargement, referring to the Western Balkans, where the processes are ongoing already for decades, to say so. What do you say on that one, on how they put it in the constitution? Is this helping, or is it just literally a symbolic act from the Ukrainian perspective?
Well, actually in 2019, and of course even more so after Russia started a large-scale war, there's a great majority of Ukrainians who want to be both members of the European Union and NATO. But the problem started earlier when in April 2008, the NATO summit in Bucharest promised Ukraine, and Georgia by the way, to eventually become members of NATO. At that time, only 19% of the Ukrainian population actually were in support of NATO membership. So when some people say if Ukraine had been accepted at that time in NATO, then Russia would not have dared to start a war. I don't think this is the case because the population in Ukraine was not ready at the time. At the same time, NATO said you will become a member of NATO in the future, but not at the moment. And by promising the membership in NATO, actually NATO crossed a very, very strong red line of the Russians. So it provoked Russia, and at the same time was not ready to defend Ukraine against an aggressive Russia. So Ukraine got a promise, but no real support. And Russia was, or felt provoked, and responded. So I think the initial crucial political mistake was the decision taken by the NATO summit in 2008.
One more thing I would like to touch upon is that there is a very, very big election this year, which is obviously the elections in the United States. From a geopolitical point of view, what do you think, Gerhard? How does this reflect then on the situation in Ukraine? Because I guess that many fear that Trump is not having such an interest in what is going on between Russia and Ukraine, especially now also with the war against Hamas in Gaza. So a lot of attention now is shifted towards the Middle East when it comes from the US perspective. How would you assess the upcoming election? What does this mean for Ukraine?
Well, actually, we are currently already in a very difficult situation when Biden asked for sustained financial and military support of Ukraine last October and asked for 61.4 billion US dollars. But so far, Congress has not passed a law on such spending. The Senate has agreed a couple of weeks ago, but in the House of Representatives, no decision was taken on this legal initiative. So US financial and military support has been blocked since the beginning of the year. We don't know if eventually Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, will put this proposal to a vote on the plenum of the House of Representatives. If he does, then indeed the House of Representatives will agree to that aid package. But at the same time, if he does so, he is very likely to lose his job as the Speaker of the Republicans in the House of Representatives. So maybe there will be some help in the next months coming from the United States to Ukraine, or maybe not. If Trump is going to be elected and becomes the next president of the United States in January next year, then it's highly likely that Trump will no longer spend significant amounts of money on Ukraine. He knows that the majority of Republican voters in the United States think that the US has helped Ukraine already enough. It should be stopped now. They think the money should be invested at home in this America First strategy. So if Trump is going to be elected, he will be sort of, he needs to be responsive to this orientation of Republican voters and stop funding. If he stops funding, then Europe cannot compensate, both economically and militarily, what is no longer given to Ukraine by the United States. And that will mean that the military position of Ukraine will weaken substantially, and Russia will have a serious prospect of gaining even more territory in Ukraine. So the vote in November of this year is crucial. If Trump wins, I think Ukraine will fail.
Richard, maybe following up on what Gerhard just said, how do you assess the situation, the US election? And maybe also we remember from the previous Trump time that he had a very, very huge focus, let's say, on China and actually to how to compete with China, especially on an economic way. But if I look at the situation, I would say that Biden is not too much different when it comes to this issue. So how do you assess the US election? What does this mean for Ukraine from your point of view?
Yeah, no, I think you're right on the broad geo-economic questions. There was actually quite a continuity from Trump to Biden, and I think this rivalry with China, from a US perspective, probably stands above all of this, and that is ultimately the most important thing. And if Trump wins, we'll probably see a further continuity of that. I mean, I fully respect Professor Mangott's view on what Trump would mean, what the Trump presidency would mean for Ukraine. It sounds unfortunately for Ukraine, a very plausible scenario. My sense is, though, that whoever is the US president, and they have had isolationist, semi-isolationist presidents before, ultimately they cannot resist the temptation to intervene because they can. And I suspect even a Trump presidency, and let's see, whoever, if in the case that he wins, who he has around him, what his team is, will not want to see Ukraine completely overrun, I would imagine. Maybe further Russian gains versus what they have at the moment. But I think what is clear from a European perspective is that this is not the US's biggest priority. It is our biggest priority in geopolitical, geo-economic terms. And so either way, we have to be prepared for the US to have a decreasing role, I would say, in Ukraine gradually over time, whoever wins. And then it's up to us. I mean, what are we willing to do? What do we want to happen in Ukraine? And as I've said, I think there is a potential positive economic scenario for whichever part of Ukraine is not controlled by Russia, where the war ends. It can follow this Central and Eastern European development path, which has been transformative. But a lot of things need to fall into place for that to happen. And I think within European politics, probably a lot still needs to change for that to happen.
Following maybe a little bit up on our last question and also what Richard just said, I mean, we talk about Ukraine, we talk about Russia, we see this whole conflict is also embedded in a geopolitical environment still. However, I think it is very important that at one point we come to a peace agreement, a peace which is sustainable, a peace which is also perceived as just for the Ukrainians, because the war is actually being fought on Ukrainian territory and against Ukrainians still, even though the West does have at one point some specific role, or the war is also spreading via economic means, or be it like propaganda and all those other issues which are coming along with this military war. What do you say, does peace matter, and what would peace actually mean for Ukraine?
Well, President Zelensky has brought forward a proposal, so-called peace formula, already in the fall of 2022. And in this proposal, which has been discussed at various meetings of Western and non-Western countries over the past 2 years, in this peace formula, Zelensky says a just and sustainable peace requires that all Russian forces leave Ukraine, including Crimea. Secondly, Russia pays reparations for the destruction brought upon Ukraine by this war. And thirdly, all the war criminals need to be brought before court. This is the peace formula of the Ukrainian government. However, this peace formula, and there will be a peace summit this year organized by Switzerland and Ukraine. This peace formula cannot become the basis for negotiations. Why? Because if the Ukrainians stick to these demands, which are perfectly understandable from a Ukrainian point of view, Ukraine needs to win this war militarily, because this peace formula means that it will be Ukraine to dictate the conditions of peace to Russia. But such a scenario where Ukraine defeats Russia along the whole line is very, very unrealistic. So I think the peace formula cannot be the basis for peace. However, at the same time, I need to say, I don't see that the peace solution will be found anytime soon. It could take 10 years or even more before a peace agreement will be signed between the two warring parties. So I think the only thing that we can dream about is, and dream about, is a freezing of the conflict and an armistice agreement between the two, which has, as I've said, pros and cons, because if the conflict is frozen according to, along the current front line, this is, of course, very good for the Russian side, because yes, they cannot claim de jure control over the occupied regions of Ukraine, but de facto control, and they can consolidate their occupation regime in these regions. And we all know how the Russians are treating the people in the occupied areas, with a lot of atrocities having been committed by the Russian side. And so, yes, a peace agreement, no. An armistice agreement, probably, but only after 1 or 2 more years of war. And it will not be a perfect solution, because it will, as I said, actually help the aggressor and not legitimize in a judicial way, but in de facto politically, Russia will be the winner of the war, even if there's no peace solution, but an armistice agreement.
There is no shortcut to peace, Richard. What would you dream about in the nearer future, let's say the next 2, 5, maybe 7 years, when it comes to the economic situation, but maybe even going on the whole situation in Ukraine and Russia? What would you dream about?
Well, I mean, I think at the moment I have more nightmares than dreams about this conflict and how it will play out. I mean, the dream would be a decisive Ukrainian victory. You know, it looks, I'm not a military expert, it looks very, very unlikely at the moment, unfortunately. But I mean, from an economic development perspective and a human social development perspective, we need a real peace, and I think that does ultimately mean a decisive Ukrainian victory and security guarantees on top of that. I think anything else, so an armistice, a ceasefire on the current line or something close to the current line, the chance of a renewed outbreak of hostilities will still be there. Now, there are economies that can grow under conditions of security threats. Israel is the example that's always mentioned. But
South Korea.
Yeah. But I fear that the Russian threat to Ukraine is rather more formidable than anything, certainly, that Israel faces. And there are private investors going into Ukraine right now. There are interesting things happening in the economy, but a really transformative socio-economic reconstruction, recovery of Ukraine, I think needs a really proper, durable peace, and I mentioned a few times now, the security guarantees that would come with that. Unfortunately, that really is, I think, a dream from the perspective of today.
Thank you so much. We are already at the end of our podcast, Peace Matters. I think you touched upon many, many different issues, many interesting issues. Obviously, we didn't manage to come up with a solution which will bring ultimately peace to Ukraine. However, I still think it's important that we need to discuss what could be steps, what could be tangible steps, not only what is wishful, even though I think it is important to have still this dream in mind that at one point Ukraine will regain its sovereignty, will regain its territorial sovereignty, and at one point it might also be part of the European family as a full European Union member. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was episode 16 of Peace Matters. I hope you found it interesting. If this was the case, please follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, and you can also find the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on YouTube.